Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. My name is Danielle Harvey and I'm the festival director. FODI is the original Disruptive Ideas Festival based in Sydney, Australia, that aims to bring to light important conversations that push the boundaries of conventional thought. FODI gathers the world's best experts, innovative thinkers and mischief makers to provoke and inspire curious minds. The gap between ordinary citizens and the privileged elite is increasing. And there's a growing anger as many begin to realise that the distribution of our social and economic pie isn't an accident. So should we be accepting that this is the way things are, or sharpening our tools of destruction to overthrow the system? Join sociologist Myra Hamilton, academic Rhodes, and activist Jordan Vandenberg as they discuss why the 1% should be afraid. This is the 2024 session, The Pitchforks Are Coming, chaired by philosopher David Blunt.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our session, The Pitchforks Are Coming, Why the 1% Should Be Afraid. I'm David Blunt. I'll be chairing this session. And I want to say a word about inequality before we start, because I've been floating around the Festival of Dangerous Ideas today and yesterday, and every session I've been to, inequality has either been at the edges or dead center. This is a topic that people care about a lot, and it might be a reason why we sold out before some other sessions. This is a popular topic. But what does it mean to experience inequality, and how do we solve it? That's what we're going to get into today. But before I introduce the panel, I want to recognize country. We're on Gadigal land. It's unceded. And I also want to recognize that this is something of a pale panel. If you said Hamilton, Rhodes, Vandenberg, and Blunt, it would sound like a white shoe New York law firm that would represent Donald Trump if he paid his bills. But poverty is a big topic. Inequality is a big topic. We can't bring every perspective. We only have an hour, but we're interested at looking at it from many different perspectives. So welcome. Let me introduce the panel. So, joining us is Carl Rhodes. Carl is a professor at the University of Technology, Sydney. He's also dean, aren't you?
I am indeed. Yeah.
We're joined by Myra Hamilton, associate professor in business and organization at the University of Sydney. And we have Jordan Vandenberg, who is an activist and political organizer. You might know him from social media as Purple Pingers or Shit Rentals. Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. Now, I think we need to start by actually defining our terms. And this is sort of a boring academic thing to say, but what are we actually talking about when we talk about the 1%, when we talk about inequality? Now, Myra, you've done a lot of great work recently looking at the elite, looking at education. Can you tell us a little bit about the 1%?
Yes, look, generally when people talk about the 1%, they're talking about people at the very top of the wealth or income distribution, usually the wealth distribution. And there is a fair bit of quibbling about exactly where the boundary lies, but there are also qualitative indicators. So, for example, over the last couple of years, we've run a series of focus groups with people from different socio-demographic groups, and we've asked them, who do you think are the very wealthy, and how do you know who they are? And people said, across all socioeconomic groups, people said the same thing. They said, we can tell by the suburbs they live in, we can tell by the schools they send their children to, we can tell by their general kind of comportment, their ease and confidence when they walk into a room. And indeed, the American sociologist Kahn described ease or surety as the kind of signature emotion of those with extreme wealth. And so, we combine these kind of more literal definitions, I suppose, with more qualitative indicators. We know most people, when we talk about the 1%, we sort of have a general sense of who they are. The other thing I'd say is that beyond the literal, it is also sort of a metaphor, the 1%, for the concentration of wealth among those at the top. And, we can talk about the top 10% or the top 1%, or the famous economist Thomas Piketty talks about the top 0.1% or the top 0.01%, but ultimately it's about a way of talking through the concentration of wealth at the top, which offers a kind of starting point, I suppose, to start challenging that distribution of wealth.
That's really interesting. Jordan, now your work is on the other side, right? Myra looks at people in that top, and now you lead category, that 1%. But you do a lot of work with people who are on the sharper end of inequality, right? People who experience housing insecurity, people who live in precarious circumstances, work in precarious workplaces. What's that like? What's their life like?
Yeah, it sucks, I guess. I don't know how else to put it. It's like you look at health outcomes, education outcomes, like all the kind of statistical stuff, but like if you go talk to them and like kind of be with them for a bit, you can and experience it. It's a completely different story to what, you know, the stats and the data and all the graphs and stuff show you. It's just a struggle. It's a constant struggle.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because when we think about inequality, when we think about wealth in our society, we often put a dollar figure on it, right? You know, I work in international poverty, and oftentimes we measure it on things like the World Bank's international poverty line of sort of $1.75 a day. But that doesn't really capture it, right? It doesn't capture wealth, and it doesn't capture poverty, which is much more phenomenological. Yeah, it's a $5 word. It's experiential. It's something that you live. It's not something that you necessarily see in a bank account, right? Do you agree with that, Carl?
Absolutely. I mean, poverty is about a poor life experience. It's about not being able to live a decent, livable life because of a financial situation that you find yourself in, not of your own making. So, I mean, you can kind of measure things in monetary terms. Even if you think, for example, you talk about the top 1%, the bottom 20% of people, wealth owners in Australia, only own 0.7% of the country's wealth. So there is really a kind of a whole kind of class of people who've been kind of classed this way, who don't get treated fairly. Australia is a prosperous country. Why is it that some people live a great life while other people can't put food on the table, can't put shelter over their heads, can't send their kids to the dentist? That is not a fair society. So ultimately, this inequality is a question of justice, or injustice more particularly.
Yeah, just so. I mean, we look at this and we say, okay, this is the 1%. There are people who have a tremendous amount of wealth and opportunity, and we have people in the bottom 10%, people who have a precarious life, a life that is difficult to get through a day, knowing if you're going to have a roof over your head the next day, whether you're going to have enough money for groceries. Now, I want to ask a question to each of you. You know, should the pitchforks be coming? Is this an extreme injustice that we should be sharpening up our tools of destruction to overthrow this system? Yes or no question first. Carl, what do you think?
No violence.
No violence. Okay, yeah. We're going to come to that. Myra, what do you think?
I agree with no violence, but I think kind of metaphorically we need action.
Okay. Jordy?
I'm not going to tell someone how to seek their own liberation. But yeah, they should come. The pitchforks should be coming.
Right. So we were saying whether should the pitchforks be coming. Now I actually want to ask the audience, by a show of hands, do we think the pitchforks should be coming for the 1%? Show of hands. Yeah? Anyone opposed? Let's say real. Okay, so we've got some people opposed too. Now, follow-up question. Are the pitchforks coming?
I'd say, I mean, it's interesting you were talking before about this notion of the 1%. Remember the idea of the 1% came from the We Are the 1%, the slogan used in the Occupy movement back in 2011, a response in many ways to the global financial crisis a few years before. And before that, issues of inequality weren't widely discussed in the media or in politics. Questions of distribution were ignored by economists. And that, in many ways, the Occupy movement came and went, but it left an indelible mark. It was effective in shifting the whole political discourse towards questions of inequality. And that has built and built and built ever since. And even the fact that we're here talking about it and that you folks have come to join us in that is a sign that inequality is an increasingly important political issue to many people, and not just to the people who suffer under the unequal society we live in, but for people who don't as well, who want to live in a fairer society, which is not justice for me, but justice for everyone. So I think the pitchforks are coming. I think they could probably come, the metaphorical ones, I think they could probably come a bit quicker.
Right. Myra, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't think they are. In the work we've been doing over the last couple of years on elite privilege, we know that people aren't happy about it. We did a national survey and almost 50% of people said they felt angry or resentful when they saw very wealthy people and celebrities having rules applied differently to them, for example. But we also heard a lot of, that's just the way things are, what can we do about it? And, I even did an interview with a very progressive journalist who said, well, this is all very good, but what's the point of writing a book about elite privilege? It's just, people are just very accepting of it, and things will just continue to go on as they are. And so while I wish that, action was on its way, that's not what I have observed in the recent work that I've done.
Jordan, are they coming?
Yeah, I think I want to preface this by saying that this may well be, my own little pocket of Melbourne that I'm in, but I am seeing the discontent and the anger more and more every day, and I'm also seeing less complacency among the people that I spend my time with. And we're seeing more and more people organising as well, but not through the traditional means, through union membership and political organising. It's around social issues instead. So I want to say yeah.
Okay. Now, audience, same question. Do you think the pitchforks are actually coming for the 1%? Show of hands. Yes? So, people think that inequality is an issue, an ethical problem, but people seem a little bit cynical about whether it's actually going to change, which is an interesting tension, I think. Let's talk about why we're worried about inequality. We sort of probed around it when we were defining our terms, right? But let's actually think about why we're concerned about inequality. And you'll have to forgive me, folks. I'm going to be putting on my Robert Nozick face, my Hayek face, my neoliberal face, and I have some questions that I want to push. Because if this was the Festival of Dangerous Ideas and we just sat around agreeing with each other, it wouldn't be particularly dangerous. So, Carl, look, someone who says, what's wrong with the 1%, they're going to say, shouldn't we have a system where people who work hard, who are talented, who put in the extra hours, who accumulate wealth, who sacrifice, things that they might enjoy to get ahead, why should we punish them, right? Do we want to be leveling society out in a way that gets rid of merit? For example, think about the Olympics. I'm never going to win an Olympic gold medal, folks. Ray Gun can out-break dance me, but it's true. But does that mean that we should get rid of the Olympics? Should we not celebrate excellence? And isn't inequality a product of some people just being excellent?
Meritocracy is not all it's cracked up to be, David. I'll tell you an example, a US example, because that's where the best statistics are. Today, a chief executive who worked for an S&P 500 company, right, biggest 500 companies in the US, earns round about 600 times as much as the average worker. And CEOs in other companies, it's about 300 and something times as much. Back in 1965 in the US, CEOs earned 65 times the average worker. So are we saying that today's CEOs are 30 times better than the CEOs back in 1965? Because if they're earning their money on merit, they must be 30 odd times better. No, of course they're not, because the assumption that hard work through merit leads to certain outcomes assumes that labour markets and other markets are fair. Now, that is a completely ridiculous assumption. The second point, however, is imagine if we actually did have a meritocracy and it was all working in place. The question is meritocracy actually a good thing in general? And I would say no, because the whole idea of democracy was a replacement of plutocracy and a replacement of feudalism and replacement of the idea that your lot in life, in the European sense, was the result of your birthright, right, who your parents were. But what about meritocracy? Say it's you and me, we're both born, and you're born, you've got a high capacity for hard work, you've got an above average intelligence, and you've got drive.
So generous.
I, on the other hand, imagine I'm born with below average intelligence, not a great deal of natural aptitude. Does that mean your kids should be fed and mine shouldn't? Of course not, because that is a birthright, just in the same way as the birthright that became before it. So meritocracy is a poor ideal on which to build a society. Mm-hmm. And it results in inequality and a winner-take-all system that's kind of going crazy at the moment.
Now, I'm just going to come back on something, and perhaps Myra, you can help me out with this. Now, a lot of people have said inequality is actually beneficial, right? When we have reasonable inequality within a society, it lifts the boats of everyone, right? The rising tide lifts all boats. This is what makes capitalism great, folks. You know, Elon Musk may be in a yacht and you may be in a dinghy, but that tide is coming up. And there's a degree of truth to that. You know, if you look at the contribution of the top 10% of taxpayers to the average tax bill, it's pretty chunky. Right? So perhaps we can say, okay, look, we may not like inequality, but maybe if we let a little bit of it in, you know, that's actually good for everyone. What do you make of that?
Well, I would say that the idea of the trickle down effect has been debunked, and that, you know, the research suggests that in countries where there is greater inequality, there are poorer social outcomes, which you would expect. Lower social cohesion, for example, poorer health outcomes. But there are also poorer economic outcomes. So in countries with greater inequality, we see higher levels of poverty and lower levels of economic growth. So the idea that by, you know, enhancing the wealth of those at the very top, everyone somehow benefits economically has been debunked. I would agree with Carl that this idea of meritocracy is this incredibly powerful myth, particularly in Australia, where we just are so attached to this idea of egalitarianism and a fair go for everyone. And so this idea that success comes from hard work is often offered as a sort of justification of inequalities and kind of very extreme wealth at the top. And what it does is it conceals a whole range of advantages that are kind of systematically conferred on people with wealth and other resources, social networks, you know, cultural capital, many of which are fostered in elite private schools that are just kind of swept to the side under this label of kind of hard work. And I'll take you up on the idea, David.
That I can break dance?
One of the areas we have looked at is sport. And in fact, what you see when you look at sport is the increasing domination of elite sport by people who've been to elite private schools. So in the UK, the US and Australia, our international rugby teams, for example, our international cricket teams in the UK and Australia are in those teams, people who have been through elite private schools are grossly overrepresented. And even in AFL, which is, you know, has a history of being a sort of fairly egalitarian sport, a recent study in Western Australia found that 7 elite private schools out of 300 high schools in the state were responsible for providing around 40% of AFL draftees. So maybe the Olympics is not the ultimate meritocracy after all.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting because, you know, this story about meritocracy, this story about sort of individuals rising with excellence, it's been around for pretty much my entire life, right? Like, I'm a kid of the Reagan years. You know, the idea that hard work will get you to wherever you want to go. I kind of know that that's a bit of bullshit, right? But a lot of people believe it. A lot of people still believe it. And Jordan, you do a lot of online work, right? And you get a lot of blowback, I think, from people who probably are unhappy with what you do, with your activism. Why do you think these people buy into this myth of excellence, of meritocracy, of inequality? Why do they seem unbothered by it?
Yeah, good question. I think it comes down to an element of aspiration. Like there's people who may not be, you know, the 1%, but by going after like the 1% or even the top 10%, top 20%, they feel like they're missing out on the opportunity to become, like, you know, to climb over someone on that ladder and become that person that's perhaps being under attack. And I saw it when I talked about squatting. It was the people that were the most incensed were not people with investment properties, let alone abandoned investment properties. They were just like regular folk that were just, you know, angry over the right to defend someone else, some other rich person's property that they didn't even know or like potentially may not even exist. They were the most angry, and that's the aspirational, you know, ladder climber.
Yeah, there's a great quote from John Steinbeck. He was sort of writing about why socialism had never taken root in America, and he said, it's because the American working class view themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. And you know what, it's not just the Americans, so we shouldn't be too judgmental. It seems to be across all of the sort of global north, there's this idea that, you know, well, tomorrow I'm going to be Elon Musk. Tomorrow I'm going to be Bill Gates. Today I might not be able to cover my rent, but, you know, I'm going to be chronically online defending Elon Musk. And that internalization of a class perspective that is completely alien, I find that fascinating. And I think that social media has definitely escalated that a lot. You know, how do these myths get made in our society is a really interesting question. Do you have any thoughts, Carl?
It's interesting. I mean, one way of defining neoliberalism, a term we kind of throw around a lot, is it reflects the internationalization and mutation of the American dream. Now, if you think about the original American dream, the term was coined by a guy called John Truslow early in the 20th century. He wrote a book called The Epic of America. And he wrote about an America where people could free themselves from the chains of the European past, could free themselves from that birthright culture, where everybody did have an opportunity. But also, it was the imagining of a society where everybody could be successful, where everybody could have a place. It was a deeply solidaristic idea of the American dream, you know, notwithstanding that other things, obviously slavery was in the face of this, but the ideal of it was about everyone having the opportunity and everyone being able to make a good life for themselves. How that's changed, particularly since the 1980s, it's become individualized. So the American dream now, the global version, is the one that Donald Trump peddles, right? This isn't that everybody can be successful, it's that anybody can be successful, but most people won't, right? So this is the question. You get this deeply social Darwinistic mutation of the American dream where we're all competing against each other, and the ones that win are the ones that win. But what the flip side of this is that if you're not successful, it's your fault. So it deeply individualizes both success and failure, and as a result, kind of spits in the face of the whole egalitarian principle on which the democratic tradition and the American experiment were based. And if you're, you know, to use the word that Trump likes to use, if you're not successful, you're a loser.
Myra, you've done a lot of work on education. How does education frame the sort of 1%, frame this inequality and make people sort of just accept it? You know, is this something that people learn in school?
I'm not sure it's something people learn in school. What I would say is that the role of elite private schools is really central to all of this. They've been described by scholars in the UK as the engine of privilege because of their just absolutely foundational role in what's been described as the transubstantiation of capital. So, you know, the children of very wealthy people have access to wealth as a resource, and by paying large amounts of money to go to an elite private school, there's a process that's been described as a sort of consecration where children in elite private schools have the opportunity to access very, very extensive and beneficial social networks with others who have advantages, and cultural capital, or this kind of ease of being in the world and navigating systems for success. So I think in that respect, for children who attend elite private schools, there is this kind of normalisation for many that they are destined for success and for kind of future wealth. But it's not something I think that goes all the way through the education system.
Now, one of the sort of most interesting things that happened in my career as an educator, I worked for the University of Cambridge doing outreach to sort of broaden our demographic of our intake. And there was a lot of self-deselection from potential candidates. People who would hear from their family, that's not the place for you. Even teachers would tell them, don't bother applying, you'll never get in. You're not from the right class, you're not the right sort of person. And I think people do get discouraged because, sometimes they're not wrong. The person who I had to sort of help them most or sort of give them most assistance came from a working class background, and she felt completely alienated in this university because it did not speak to her experience at all. So these educational institutions have been set up for a certain type of people, and they may not intentionally create discriminatory boundaries, but they exist, right? People have a psychological barrier against participating in them because you need to speak in the proper way. You need to wear the proper clothes. You need to be comfortable, right? And that creates soft exclusion throughout. Now, we've talked about the problems of inequality, right? And it seems that the neoliberal myth I was trying to sell has been exploded. I mean, I'm convinced. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to go home and burn my Hayek books. But this brings us to the second thing that I want to ask, what is to be done, right? This is Lenin's question, right? What do we do in the face of injustice that we all agree, well, let's say the majority of us agree, is a problem? Now, I was at the Is Democracy Worth Dying For session, and one of the things that came out is that people thought our current social systems are sclerotic. They're not working. The biggest round of applause, I think, came on the idea that democracies are not solving inequality. So I'm going to ask the panel, and Jordi, I'll start with you. If you could do one thing to change equality in this country, to shrink inequality, what would you do?
Yeah, well, I think what we're seeing at the moment is like a number of symptoms of a greater issue, and that is our economic system. So we're seeing, housing crisis pop up here. We're seeing stuff happening in education and education outcomes and health and all these random things, and we keep trying to address those little symptoms of this broader cancer that is capitalism or neoliberalism. And so just a small change would be like, let's get rid of those.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's easily done. So our first suggestion is the abolition of private capital. Myra, do you want to aim a bit higher?
Oh, look, it's a difficult question to just pick one. I think one thing we need to do is actually start to actively push back using the language of class diversity. So, for example, the work that we've done has showed that across a range of social institutions, while we're seeing improvements in, say, gender diversity or cultural diversity, we're actually seeing a decline in class diversity or diversity in educational backgrounds, for example. So with things like Rhodes scholarships, the honours system, the judiciary, we're seeing the overrepresentation of people from very wealthy backgrounds and an underrepresentation of people from other backgrounds. And so we don't really have a sort of language that we use. The language in gender diversity is very well developed now to sort of say, hey, where are the people from different sorts of socioeconomic backgrounds on the High Court bench, for example. So I would say we need to start pushing back through all of those social institutions.
Okay, very good. I agree. Carl, same question.
I think there are some very tangible things that absolutely could be done. I think the one you start with is taxing the rich. There's a recent book, a great book by Ingrid Robertson she's a Dutch philosopher, it's called Libertarianism, where she says, what about if once you get 10 million euros in wealth, that's it, you can't go higher than that. Just set an absolute cap. So that's a provocative idea, right? But some kind of limit on wealth and income. That tax can then be used to fund a universal basic income and can be used to fund social housing and can also be used to fund a free education system. So you hit it on both sides, right? You hit it on the reducing the level of extreme wealth and using that taxation benefit to fund the fact that everybody in the country can live a decent, livable life, and at the same time give people more opportunities through free education. So I think there are some very simple policy things that can be done. What I don't know how to change is the absolute lack of political will by any major party to take this action head on. I'll leave you to answer that one, David.
I mean, the first thing that I'll say is that I'm not sure capping individual wealth is an easy ask in a democratic society, but we'll say that it is. The thing that strikes me with this is the possibility of actually seeing these changes in society, right? Do people think that any of these solutions, whether it's the abolition of private capital, a changing of our ideology to be more class representative, or sort of putting a cap on wealth for universal income, is going to happen in any developed democracy in the next 20 years? No. One person, hey, that's good. I love an optimist. Round of applause for the optimist, folks. This raises sort of big questions. If we think our institutions are failing, this is speaking to sort of what Jordy's saying, right? This is not sort of a nibbling around the issues problem. This isn't something that can be done by sort of replacing our leaders once every 4 years. This seems more systemic, more challenging, and I think will probably be opposed. Now, Myra, you look like you want to come in, but just a second. One of the things that a lot of right-wing people say is that there's been a Marxist march through the institutions, right? It's a spread of cultural Marxism, capturing things like the universities and the schools and the bureaucracy. I don't think anything could be further from the truth, right? We're not seeing these radical options coming from our social institutions. In fact, we see the march of institutions, or the march through institutions, being done by the very wealthy, right? We see elite capture of these institutions. How do we check that? Right? How do we actually get class on the agenda? How do we actually start questioning ownership of production? How do we start capping wealth? How does this actually start affecting policy? Would be the question that I would have. And anyone can jump in.
I mean, we all came up with kind of, quite hopeful scenarios, but in a way, to say that those things are all very difficult kind of lets our leaders off the hook, right? I mean, I think we can start small, and there seems to be a lack of political will to do even the smallest things. I mean, the perfect example is tax concessions on large contributions to the building funds of elite private schools, for example. I mean, it's possible for people, very, very wealthy people, to make, $80 million donations to an elite private school that will be enjoyed only by the children of very, very wealthy people, and for this to be, heavily subsidised by the taxpayer. And in the recent Productivity Commission inquiry into philanthropy, the Productivity Commission, an economically conservative statutory body, recognised that this was a distortion of the charitable giving principle and recommended a change. It was kind of gifted to the Labor Party. The Labor Party said they would look at all of the recommendations by the Productivity Commission, but ruled out even considering that recommendation. So to me, that's a relatively small, contained thing that they could at least agree to look at. And yet there is a lack of political will among our more progressive major party to do even that.
I mean, perhaps the problem is that, we're expecting politicians to lead us, right? We call them leaders, but perhaps they should actually be following. Right? Now, Jordan, you do a lot of work in activism. We talked about rent strikes a few days ago. Do you think that ordinary folk are the people who actually should be spearheading this?
Yeah, definitely. I don't think we get if it's not led by ordinary folk, then the outcomes are biased towards the people leading them, and we're seeing that at the moment in Parliament happening. Where over half of them are landlords, and our housing crisis house prices, housing unaffordability, all that is going through the roof, and that's because they're not led by, regular folk. We're being led by landlords, and we're seeing that in real terms.
Do you think people should break the law to protest this? Is this something that people should be on the street? Should people be squatting in unoccupied homes? Should people be, being vigilantes, right? Should they be sharpening the pitchforks?
I think only one of those things that you said is actually breaking the law.
Is it illegal to sharpen a pitchfork?
No, it was the vigilante stuff.
Okay.
Yeah. I think they should be doing all of those things. Maybe I don't know how you define vigilantism, though, but all the other things, absolutely.
Carl, what do you think? Do you think people should be, protesting in a way that is, violates the law sometimes? Should unjust law be disobeyed?
There would be times when an unjust law should be disobeyed, but I think in the case of looking at inequality, individual acts of this kind of disobedience I don't necessarily think are going to create change. I think change comes, in a democratic society, the politicians are not the leaders. The leaders are the people, and the decisions that are made in a somewhat idealistic kind of way are based on the common will. And so it is the common will that first needs to change. An act of protest, an act of political activism of a variety of different kinds can change the zeitgeist. And there is some evidence that that's changing with inequality. We've just discussed that already. But if you look at social movements and big changes, they don't arise because of a light bulb idea from a politician. They rise from the streets. And so I think questions of democratic participation, and that includes through acts of dissensus and through acts of protest, which do not need to be law-breaking, and in order to build, as I said before, a sense of solidarity around the call for justice and shared prosperity is what needs to build. And enough people follow it, and if there's going to be votes in it, the politicians will be there.
Myra, do you have thoughts on sort of how change is operationalized? Should people be on the streets? Should they be sharpening pitchforks? Or do you think there is sort of ways to do this within the social system we have?
I think it needs to be both.
Okay.
I agree with Carl. I think we need activism. I agree with Geordie. I think it needs to be driven by people, including people who are experiencing socioeconomic disadvantage. But I also think that part of the problem of the concentration of extreme wealth is a kind of undermining of our political and social institutions. When you have, for example, when you have rules being applied differently to people with extreme wealth to the way they're applied to everyone else, people lose faith in the rules and they lose faith in our social institutions. And so I think what we need is kind of to invest in our political and social institutions, to demand more of our political and social institutions, and to involve those institutions in the solution, as well as building, kind of protest from the streets, I suppose.
Yeah. One of the ways that inequalities manifested recently that I think is fairly profound is along generational lines. Right? There's this idea that the younger generation, I speak now as an aggressively middle-aged person, has a rawer deal, right? That life is harder, that you don't get a good job when you get out of, say, university, or you can't afford to go to university. I think we should probably talk about that a little bit, this difference between the generations, because when we look at political power, politicians tend to cater to a grayer audience, right? Should young people buy into this system? How do young people get their rightful slice? Jordan, you're the youthful one here, man. I'm going to leave it to you, if you wouldn't mind.
I'll see what I can do. I think it also goes to your previous question, where young people are being asked, we're given a system that doesn't work for us, that we don't agree with, and we're being asked every day to, work within the system to help change the system, and that's not working and hasn't been working for years. So yeah, I think we've got to think a little bit outside the box. But also, everything sucks at the moment. Unless your parents are landlords, that's kind of the determining factor of, and the postcode you're born in, all these things that are just come down to luck of the draw based on the day you're born. That we don't work. No matter how hard you work, if your parent wasn't a landlord, if your parent is renting now, what's going to become of you in 10 years? We are screwed.
What do you think, Carl?
I would agree, even though I don't currently have the experience of being a young person. But I think if you think of it even historically in terms of this country, the Australian dream was always the dream of home ownership. And if you think about that as a country here of settlers, and obviously the issue of land here and the notion of land as property has a whole lot of connotations in terms of First Peoples. But what was promised to settlers was that they could own land. And they would have come from societies not a generation or two ago where land ownership was exclusively the domain of the lord of the manor or kind of aristocratic people. So the whole idea of Australia was that land ownership goes to everybody. So what now, when home ownership is so out of reach by anyone who doesn't have, mommy and daddy's money, is so out of reach, that's such an incredible regression, almost, returning to a kind of different feudalism, a kind of neo-feudalism. And home ownership is central to this from a very meaningful historical perspective for this particular country.
It's a really interesting observation, because home ownership does seem to be sort of almost an obsession in the English-speaking world, at least. But I think there's something to be said about, why don't we have adequate social housing, right? Why are we fixated on ownership of property when, as a community, we can provide, accommodation for people that don't need to own, right? This was a huge part of the post-war settlement in Britain, the building of council flats, for example. This idea that, owning a home isn't a mandatory thing to be a successful or good member of your community. The community should provide you with a home. Have we become just obsessed with this idea of ownership? Myra, what do you think?
Yes, I do think that. And, I think it's partly associated with what Carl said. It's just this kind of extreme attachment to the idea of the Australian dream, and that being one in which we own a home. And it's almost as if the more unobtainable that becomes for a group of people, the more kind of we're preoccupied with that with that dream, without addressing the major barriers to achieving it. I mean, in terms of the generational argument, I agree that kind of younger people are facing, extreme challenges, not just in the housing market, but also in the labour market with, very precarious work. But there's this tendency to sort of characterise it as a generational war, and often people are very quick to blame the baby boomers, the people love to blame the baby boomers for for everything. I mean, I read in the paper recently that baby boomers were to blame for single-use plastic overuse. They created a spoilt society. And so I think the problem is we're focusing in the wrong place. We're focusing on a generation war, on baby boomers and their fault. And not really trying to address the systematic policy failures that have created a situation where it's not only difficult to purchase a home, but it's actually difficult to rent a home.
Yeah, that's extremely true. And I think, the idea that we should blame the older generation really masks the overwhelming systemic disadvantages, that, it's an easy target to have. But I think it's time to let the audience have their shot. So if we could set up the microphone so we can take questions from the audience in the final 15 minutes. But I do want to push on something with elite private schools, right? So what you were talking about with donations to elite private schools seems to be, a no-brainer, right? Someone shouldn't be able to give $80 million to a private school that's free from taxation and write it off. And probably the majority of people in this audience would agree with that sentiment. Yet, We're not going to see that be legislated against, as you said. How have these elite institutions effectively managed to take control of democracy, to control this legislative agenda? And you know better than anyone in this room on it.
Well, it's a very good question. Look, I think that people with very high levels of wealth also tend to have very high levels of influence. With wealth comes influence. With wealth comes social influence, cultural influence, political influence, and an understanding of how to navigate systems to achieve an outcome that enables them to protect or maintain their own wealth. And I think that's what happened in this case. I haven't studied the particular machinations of why the Labor Party made that announcement, but in many other cases that I've looked at.
Thank you very much. Well, we're going to open up for questions now, folks. I'm just going to say, we're at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. I know that everyone is super clever. But if you want to make a statement, that's great. Talk to us afterwards. What we're looking for is questions. And we've got some lines happening here. So if they can be as concise as possible, we would very much appreciate it, because I want everyone to have their say. Would you like to start us off, please, on this side?
Hi, thanks so much. I'm Jessica from Basic Income Australia, so glad to hear that UBI is part of the solution. I think the ideas are all quite interesting. A cap of individual wealth, class diversity, get rid of the capitalist system entirely, and UBI. If we have to prioritise actions, what would you recommend?
It's a great question. Who wants to start with prioritising? Jordy, what do you say?
I reckon we can do it gently and just tax rich people first. Let's give it a go. If it doesn't work, we'll try something else.
I would agree. I think realpolitik has to come in here as well, and changing the whole capitalist system. Maybe more of a multi-generational project. Taxing the rich, that could be much quicker and hit things very soon.
I agree.
Right. I think we should fire up the Marxist meat grinder and start the revolution. It will obviously begin here at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. And people will look back and say, this is the moment the spark was lit. Just after the session is over. Sir.
There are approximately 800 billionaires in the United States. It's been calculated if there was a wealth tax of 5% of their net worth, that would be enough to eliminate all student debt and provide healthcare for all in the economy. I can understand 800 people voting against that, but 350 million people would benefit from that. Why is there the lack of political will to do something like that, to create some sort of, equality and make things better for people?
Fabulous question. Who wants to start us off?
It's a big question, and I don't think one that can be answered kind of satisfactorily quickly, but there's something located in our culture that seems to moralize wealth and think that it's earned meritocratically, think that people deserve it, think that people are self-made, and at the same time, a whole lot of confusion potentially about what the answers may be. But I think the answers to these questions are cultural as much as they are legislative, because if you don't change, if you don't kind of try to influence culture around what wealth means and how kind of obscene and terrible it's becoming, you won't. But it seems to be embedded somehow that inequality, extreme inequality, is okay, and I think that's what we also need to challenge.
I would add that I think one of the things that some of these billionaires have done very successfully is to cast themselves as philanthropists. And what that means is that they are able to set an agenda about what the problems are and what the solutions should be, while at the same time kind of deflecting attention away from their responsibility to contribute to the social problems that other people kind of perceive. And so I think that's one of the ways that the billionaires themselves have created a situation in which there's less pressure on them to be taxed in a way that goes into a tax base where governments and those who elect them decide where that money should go.
I also think that there's an element of you know, there are a certain amount of people who aspire to be the people that they don't want to tax effectively, but I also think some of it comes down, like at least some of it comes down to our politicians being cowards.
The thing that I'll add on that is that people are tired, right? You know, you work a 60-hour work week, you're exhausted, right? Politics takes time. You know, Oscar Wilde said, the problem with socialism is that it takes up too many evenings. There's only so many hours in the day, right? Change comes very slowly sometimes, and if you have a lot of people who are working hard, who are demoralized, getting galvanized for change is incredibly difficult. And you get this constant stream from social media telling you how smart Elon Musk is, and eventually you just switch off and your brain defaults, I think. I think this is a big influence. You know, it's the ideology, and it affects people. Can we have a question from you, miss?
Hi. So it took over 30 minutes for anyone on the panel to even name capitalism, let alone correctly identify capitalism as the cause of this brutal inequality, and even then the word was only said once in this entire panel. The capitalist system perpetuates and profits from inequality, and it cannot be reformed to be more equitable because it by definition requires the ruling class subjugation of the working class. My question is, why are you so hesitant to identify capitalism as the cause of this inequality? And why do you leap to condemn hypothetical violence of a mass movement of the working class seeking to liberate themselves, but not condemn the daily violence of the capitalist system?
Thank you, comrade. Who wants to start us off? Jordan, I feel like you're exempt from this question. Why not name capitalism? I mean, I think people do. I think this is sort of one of the things that we've got to is that there are systemic problems. There are systemic problems with this, but, you know, it's a lot more difficult, at least in my reading, than sort of getting people out on the street, right? We can condemn capitalism, but a lot of people are, I hate to say it, they're more comfortable with the devil they know, right? What comes after capitalism is very difficult. You know, Mark Fisher calls this capitalist realism, right? It defines the possibilities that we can get into. And a lot of people have trouble pushing past that, and I've included myself in that. Do you have any thoughts?
I hadn't realized we hadn't mentioned capitalism. I mean, capitalism is the nature of the problem. The question of is, can there be a variety of capitalisms, and is there any hope left for the kind of juncture of liberalism and capitalism that we see? I'm guessing you think there isn't by the nature of your question. I probably retain a little bit more hope in the possibility of what Joe Stiglitz calls a progressive capitalism, and the ability of a situation where productive activity organized in a kind of competitive way can somehow serve the interests of society, rather than the situation we have now where it's the other way around. So I would agree that capitalism is the cause of the problem, but replacing it with an alternative kind of socialist or communist system, I don't see that necessarily working. So I think there needs to be other kinds of reforms of the types we've been talking about here.
On this side, we're running short on time, folks, so can I get 3 questions in a row and we'll try to get to them?
Okay, I'll be brief. Myra, you correctly debunked trickle-down economics, but a lot of the discussion predicated on economic growth. What do we do in a carbon-constrained world where economic growth will be much more diminished?
Hi, I'm Heather. We talked a lot about systematic problems and solutions. I'm really curious to hear from each of you what is something that each one of us could be doing. We're not politicians, we're not in government, we're not in power. Maybe some of us are, but I certainly aren't. What's something that the everyday people can be doing to work against inequality?
And Sir, would you like to give us our final question?
Thank you, David. All 3 panelists have said tax the rich. Precisely what makes someone rich, and how would you tax them?
That's a great question. Does anyone want to jump onto one? I think the question about what we can do is very pertinent.
Can I start with the tax?
Please, start wherever you want.
Because it's right. So I think part of the issue is that whenever we try and have a conversation about taxing the rich, The very rich are very good at hiding among the kind of generally well-off. And so what happens is that, the sort of much larger category of people who are generally well-off are kind of co-opted into this opposition to the idea of taxing the very, very rich. I think a good place to start is actually saying, well, we're not talking about people who are generally are generally comfortable, right? We're talking initially, or I'm talking initially, about the very, very wealthy. It's similar when we talk about changing the treatment of private schools. Generally what happens is the elite private schools, the sort of $30,000 or $40,000 a year fee schools say, this is really terrible for the sector, and the much larger group of sort of low fee or lower fee private schools, predominantly Catholic schools, are kind of brought into the argument that this would have a very bad impact on the sector, and it kind of disguises the injustice of the kind of accrual of extreme wealth at the very top. So I would say, who are we taxing? Those at the very top is actually, what I am talking about, is that the sort of, that those with very, very extreme wealth, there is income tax, there is, all that could happen with the tax deductibility of private schools. Superannuation is another one. The housing policies and so on would be a good place to start.
Jordy, do you have any final thoughts on these three questions?
Yeah, I think I forget the order of the questions, but to the environmentalism one, I believe environmentalism without class struggle is just gardening, and that the system will collapse before we get to that stage, I believe, because we're seeing so many more fractures every single day that by the time we get to that end stage, I think we'll be done anyways. But also, I think to the tax the rich question, I think we've got anyone who benefits from the big three are franking credits, negative gearing, and the capital gains tax exemption. Like, if you're enjoying those are things I think you should be taxed on. You're not necessarily the 1%, but those kind of tax policies are really hurting us, and I feel like that's some positive tax policy we can do.
Carl, closing idea or thoughts?
I think the tax question is actually relatively simple. It's about progressive income taxation, it's about wealth taxation, it's about inheritance taxation, and also taxation on second homes. Because remember, we talked about before about this issue of people not being able to afford homes. But from everyone who can't afford a home, there's one other person who's got two and is renting one of them to them. So again, a primary inequality. So what can be done about taxation is actually relatively simple. I mean, you have to deal with the rampant tax avoidance and tax evasion that rich people do very effectively as well. But the mechanisms are there. As I said before, what's not there is the political will. I mean, some would argue that Bill Shorten lost the election a few years ago because of the franking credits question, and the way the opposition kind of beat that up to make out that kind of, everyone was going to be affected. So there's an important debate to be had, and for that debate to translate into real policy. But the policy question is simple. It's the decision that people aren't willing to make.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to put a cat among the pigeons. We've talked a lot in this session about the state, Australia, the United States. But if you're part of the global 1%, and these figures are a little bit out of date, they come from our good friends at Credit Suisse from 2019. If you're part of the 1%, you have about $850,000 of assets. That is a significant slice of the population of the global north. Indeed, I hate to say it, the 1% might be in this very room right now. The call is coming from inside the house. When we talk about sharpening the pitchforks, we might want to be careful. The pitchforks might be coming for us. And that inequality is not simply at the state level, It is a global issue. It has many facets. I would like to thank you all for your patience. I would like to thank you for the panel. It's been a wonderful session, everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of your FODI. A round of applause for our panelists.
This session was recorded live at Carriageworks Sydney in August 2024. The Festival of Dangerous Ideas is presented by the Ethics Centre. The Ethics Centre delivers programs and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of our life. We offer counselling for individuals, leadership and development services, events, courses and educational resources. As a not-for-profit charity, we rely heavily on donations and memberships. Please visit ethics.org.au to find out more. Thank you.